So let's go ahead and get some of the big stuff out of the way because we want to make sure that we leave no stone unturned here. And as you know, I am often ridiculed by my fellow colleagues that my news is very depressing. So let's just get the boring and depressing right out of the gate. Then we can move on to the fun and entertaining. So, a couple of things that are really important for our audience to pay attention to, especially if this is an area of interest to you. The first is a call to action. If you would like an opportunity to voice your concerns about the change of availability and accessibility for oral fluoride supplementation and prescriptions, the open comment period from the federal government is through July 16th. You can find that link through the FDA website. They are open to receiving particularly comments from practitioners who are currently writing prescriptions for ingestible fluorides to understand practice philosophies, presentations, risk management, and why those fluoride supplements are being prescribed so that they can take those things into consideration when looking at whether or not to pull this pharmaceutical drug off the market. So, again, that open comment period is July 16th. If you would like to get your voice heard as a practitioner who is writing prescriptions for fluoride, please take advantage of that. If you don't, you have no one to blame but yourself when they take your privilege away. Another interesting update, and I have to thank the ADA for this particular lobbying effort. They went straight to MetLife. We can specifically talk about this insurance company because it was of high concern of the ADA after receiving several member complaints that MetLife would recoup expenses or recoup payments from other practitioners. So let me explain what that means. If I were to provide a service to a patient in my practice who is a MetLife patient and I submit for payment for those services, the insurance company could take that money away from me because because they were due that money to Jeff, let's just say, and they decided the patient wasn't eligible for that service from Jeff. So instead of going back to Jeff to recoup the money that had been paid to Jeff for services rendered by that MetLife patient, they would come and then take it out of the very next claim that was being paid, regardless of who the practitioner is. Now, you can appreciate the accounting nightmare that starts to create when we're recouping expenses or recouping monies being paid from practitioners that aren't even in the same practice. So this has been going on quite often. In fact, we were just discussing a case in my practice today. MetLife is set to change this particular policy. It is expected to be in full effect by the end of the year. If they need to recoup money for a claim that should not have been paid for a patient who wasn't eligible for that service, whatever the happenstance might be, they must go back to that practitioner or that practice to recoup that money, which may mean a paper check back from the practice, as opposed to withholding it from the upcoming payments on behalf of that patient. So I think that's a fantastic move. Thank you to the ADA for stepping in and voicing that concern. Thank you to MetLife for recognizing this is a stupid policy and that it should have never been in place in the first place. And that maybe finally we're going to get some resolution for these idiotic policies that continue to be put in place by dental insurance companies. So, really excited to see that type of movement. Now, I wanted to give you an update now that the big, beautiful bill has been passed and we're starting to see some of the more intricate details of that bill. There were some big wins, particularly for the small business owners, dental practices specifically. We had talked quite a bit about the SALT Act and about the change in the ability to pass through local and state tax. Luckily, that was pushed up to 40,000. So I think for the majority of practitioners, except maybe a very few elite folks in New York and California, this should allow most individuals in the US to pass through in full their state and local tax liabilities so that they don't get double taxed on that money. So that was a good update that we saw that was finalized in its final version of the bill. A couple of other things that we saw come through that we're seeing that 20% small business tax deduction will stay permanent, restoration of 100% bonus depreciation, new domestic tax, research tax incentives, the preservation of 21% corporate tax rate, And then, of course, that $40,000 individual and state local tax deduction. Now, one big negative I think that might impact some of our colleagues had to do on the loan side of education. The Grad Plus loan program and cap lifetime financial aid amounts for undergraduate and graduate students did limit those loan repayment options. And so we may see for the first time some restriction and some inability for individuals to receive funding for dental education. We'll see what that really looks like in real time. But the concern is that could ultimately impact workforce shortages. But I think overall, especially for small business owners, dentists who are operating independently, this should be a very good bill for their overall tax burden. All right. So, as promised, one entertaining story. Now, this happened right before I left on vacation, which was super frustrating to me because I love these kind of stories. I love to go on the news and talk about interesting pop culture. Well, LeAnn Rimes had a bit of a dental mishap a couple weeks ago at the end of June. She was performing live on stage singing one of her most famous songs, and out pops her front bridge. Now, she immediately rushed off stage to try to assess the situation, um, slid it back into position, went back out, and as any true professional would do, the show went on. About every third to fourth line in any song, she was seen having to push the bridge back into position. Now, why does this story ring so real for me? Because I too, while not LeAnn Rimes and certainly not on a public stage, have suffered a similar fate. I'm missing congenitally 7 and 10. And it was not that long ago at a Chicago midwinter that I managed to lose one of my Pontics out of my Invisalign tray into the sink of the Chicago hotel. Now, lucky for me, Chicago Midwinter has a myriad of vendors available who were very nice. Voco was very nice to offer me composite and a curing light so that I could restore my front tooth and re enter the workforce and meet with folks that day. But I can feel the pain, the embarrassment, but also as a professional that the show must go on. And with that, that's the news.